Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So here I am in Primrose Hill, London, and behind me is the house where Sylvia Plath lived from 1960 to 61. So she's a celebrated poet, or poetess perhaps I should say, a martyr for the feminist movement, certainly in the minds of some feminists. She was born in Massachusetts in the United States in 1932 to a father who was originally German. Her mother's parents had immigrated from Austria. I'm not sure if she grew up speaking German actually, and she's from quite a distinguished and academic family. Her father was a biologist, an apiarist, really, who published some scholarly papers on the humble bumblebee. So they lived in and around Boston throughout her childhood. She had one elder brother, but I don't remember his name. So that's a rather small family for the time. But even at being the height of the Great Depression, they had a fairly comfortable existence because of her father's job. But she was very close to her father. She was noted for her academic precocity. She was writing from her earliest childhood, and it's very obvious that she was a real budding talent. But when she turned 8, and just 10 days later, her father died. I can't remember what disease he died of. Now, this was a very bitter blow. It cast a pall of sorrow over the whole of the rest of her life. And even almost to her dying day, she was composing poems to Daddy. So she missed him very sorely. So people who experience the death of a parent early in life seem to go one of two different ways. They either embrace life and never waste a moment wallowing in grief, or else they are forever stricken by this, and the sense of bereavement never lifts. And she was the latter case. As became evident, she was also afflicted by bipolar disorder, so she was suffering a severe depression much of her life. Of course, these things can't really be diagnosed at the age of 18 because in adolescence it might just be some sort of adolescent fit of the blues, some difficulty adjusting as you're moving towards adulthood. But anyway, such were academic gifts. She went to Smith College, which is an all-female college to this day, in a small town in Massachusetts. I think it's Northampton. I've even been to Northampton, and I went to a production in 1995 of which play was Educating Rita in some women's college there. It might even have been Smith, I don't quite recall. She carried off all the glittering prizes in literature. I'm not sure how good she was at foreign languages, but there was a junior year abroad. That sort of program was just starting, and so she came to Cambridge University. She was there at Newnham College, which was an all-female college. I'm not sure if it's all girls to this day. And that's where she met Ted Hughes, who was slightly older than her. So 1950s Cambridge was peopled mostly by upper-class male undergraduates from southern England. Now, Ted Hughes bucked the trend. He was from a lower middle-class family in Yorkshire, and had a mild but unmistakable Yorkshire accent. So perhaps didn't quite fit in. I wonder if he got ribbed at all for his country bumpkin ways, or coming from a relatively humble background. They weren't really into widening access in those days. So he was already noted as an accomplished poet, and they shared this passion for poetry, so the two fell deeply in love. And she graduated and they got married a couple of years later here in London. So she got married at the age of 24, if memory serves, which would not have been considered young back in those days. If you're in a serious relationship, you got married. People didn't play around, well, I'll try a few relationships, wait till I'm 30. If I'm in a semi-serious relationship, well, I might think about it in my 30s, which would be more the modern attitude. And of course, in the 1950s, if you're going to get married, were you going to have children? Well, you wouldn't even think about it. Of course you would. Everybody did. It didn't appear to be a choice not to have children, though it might have started to be a question of just how many. So they got married in the UK. The lovebirds moved to the United States, where Ted Hughes got a job at Smith College as his wife's alma mater. She briefly taught there, but she felt this didn't allow her enough time to compose her own verses. So she's quite a modern poet. I've got to say her oeuvre is not to my taste, but I don't think it's dreadful. It does sometimes rhyme, and so it's innovative in its use of imagery, somewhat influenced by the beat generation. I don't think she's really seen as a beat poet, but that was the type of poesy du jour in the 1950s. Anyway, some of the undergraduates had the hots for Professor Hughes, because in the United States almost all academics get that title, professor or assistant professor. And some of them were naive enough to come knocking on his door, telling his wife that they'd really like to meet this man one-on-one. Anyway, so their marriage was tempestuous. He was supposedly an abusive alcoholic, and his wife was really was wounded by his repeated infidelities. They moved back here to the United Kingdom, and they had a daughter and a son. There was also a miscarriage. And things got even worse. Then Sylvia Plath, she'd been cutting herself, sometimes seeing whether she had the courage to actually end her own life, as she saw it. So she was being treated. She did have some antidepressants, but not enough, too late. And then he moved out. He began an affair with a woman who was already on her third husband, who was a bit older than Sylvia Plath. So then in 1963, when she was still 30, Sylvia Plath, she put the children in a different room. She sort of boarded up the kitchen, tried to make it airtight, and put her head in the gas oven, thereby committing suicide. A nurse came round to help her later that day and found her dead. So there's some debate, did she intend to die? I think it's very obvious that she did, because she's trying to preserve the children from those noxious fumes. So that's that. She's buried in her husband's Yorkshire village. So that is the short and rather tragic life of Sylvia Plath. The one thing is, when she finally split from Ted Hughes, that led to a real flowering of her creativity. So in terms of her works, that was actually the best thing that ever happened to her. But many feel the world was deprived of a magnificent poet. Had she lived on, could have produced far more gems of the language. You can see that film Sylvia about her came out in 2003, starring Gwyneth Paltrow. Well, she's there in the title role. So that's enough about Sylvia Plath. Of course, as a German name should be Plath. She didn't die in that house. She actually died in a house a few streets away from here, still in Primrose Hill. After she split from Ted Hughes, she moved out of there, and then she committed suicide in that other house, which had previously been occupied by William Butler Yeats. She thought that was an auspicious omen that W.B. Yeats had lived there. Her husband, Ted Hughes, he took up with that other woman, moved to South London, and that other woman also committed suicide and killed her own child just before taking her own life. So Ted Hughes' life was pretty dreadful. He later became Poet Laureate, as in the United Kingdom's official poet. He held the post for life, the last ever person to do so. Since then, it's given out for 10 years, but he's quite a contentious figure now, because long after his death, epistolary evidence came to light. Well, he'd written himself, saying how he used to hit his wife. He'd hit her a few days before she had a miscarriage and things like that. So, okay, she was already severely mentally ill, but his abusive behaviour pushed her over the edge. Were it not for that, she might not have terminated her own life. So that is Sylvia Plath. Okay, so please follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and so on. And I know you're going to make huge donations via PayPal. Toodaloo, everyone.